Oh, Dan Costello? Maybe not.
And welcome to the start of our next panel. Not that one, they're working it. But we're going to talk with these award-winning journalists, award-winning as recently as the most recent SABEW Best in Business Awards. And we're going to talk about how they got their great stories. But more importantly, we're going to talk about the tactics, the strategies that it takes to land these great stories, because I don't want them just to indulge in telling us about the great journalism that they brought to the fore. I want them to offer great ideas that you can use in your newsrooms and in your work. So let me welcome Suzanne Stevens, the editor of the Portland Business Journal, Marcus Barham, special projects editor at Capital and Maine, and Matthew Rose, enterprise editor at the Wall Street Journal. Thank you all for joining us. And
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, and congratulations again to all three of you on your SABEW Best in Business Awards this year. I want to start by reading some of the headlines that were your award-winning content, just to set the stage, and then I'll dive into some of the ideas that I outlined just a moment ago. Matthew, the award-winning entries for the Journal's General Excellence Award included Inside TikTok's Highly Secretive Algorithm, Deep effing value on Reddit, a feature on Keith Gill.
That one read itself.
Get swear words in. That's tactic number one.
Yeah, I had to read that twice.
Amazing.
Buying and selling by Fed officials amid the severe COVID volatility, the end of the GE we knew, and the Facebook files. Great work on such compelling companies and provocative topics. Marcus, the headlines on your pieces are the topics where America's racial wealth gap is enormous and getting worse. And then a drunk mechanic, shackled immigrants, a crash landing. The dangers of ice flights. That's a clickable headline.
Yes. Workshopped that many times.
Yeah.
And then Suzanne, a racial lens on lending, which is such an extraordinary but not shocking result, unfortunately. We're finding that white homeowners get outsized share of mortgages in BIPOC communities.
Majority minority census tract. So the data tells the story on that one.
And then also how the mass bulldozing of homes in an urban renewal project left a lot of losers more than winners. And then a deep dive on the multi-billion-dollar collegiate scholarship business and how few students will likely strike it rich as a result of that. I wanted to give the audience just a sense of the breadth and the groundbreaking nature of some of those stories. And in preparing for today's panel, it struck me, Suzanne, when you said to me that you said, rewrite the nut graph until you get it right. After months of reporting, we were reworking this on the page the day before we went to press, which says to me that, it's one of those wonderful project that a sculptor or a painter is maybe never done with, like sanding off the edge just one more time, going from light green to lighter green if you're a painter. Tell us about the working of that nut graph. And I'm going to encourage the panelists to jump in, as I said before, productively whenever they have a contributing thought that might help further the conversation.
It's different with every reporter that I work with. We have a newsroom of 5 reporters in Portland, and I think everyone has won a SABEW over the years. So we're very fortunate to just have an incredibly strong team, and also a team of reporters that generates ideas. So that's certainly a tactic if you're a reporter, to build that partnership with your editor, because I think every story you mentioned there started with the reporter coming to me and pitching the story. And then it's mapping it out over months. And it is different with every reporter when it comes to a nut graph. I like to write the nut graph. I find I write better nut graphs after everything else has been done, because at that point you've distilled, and sometimes over months, each of those stories that were mentioned were worked on for months. You've distilled the key points. And so when I'm editing a story, and we write in sections with subheads, because it's just easy to organize a long-form story that way. As I'm editing a story, I'll start writing off to the side, what's the most important thing in that section, in that 400-word to 500-word section of this 2,000-word story? And so then when I go back to do the nut graph, I know that here's my little list of the key points. that I don't want the reader to be surprised by anything by the time they get to the end of the story. They'll be surprised by some of the details, but you don't want something coming out of the blue and introducing a completely new idea at 1,700 words of a 2,000-word story. So by taking those little notes out to the side and knowing what those key points are in each of those sections allows us to then go back together with the reporter and let's craft this perfect nut graph so that that is going to be the most important thing that the reader reads in that first, say, 300 words of the story. So they're going to know where is this story headed, and we want to tease them with some of the key points.
You know, and Matthew, a nut graph can, I guess, drive you nuts, right? The first one is probably most certainly not the last one. How do you and your team help the writers craft the nut graph on key stories?
So, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always fun to talk about these things and important too. I totally agree that the whittling process at the end is crucially important. I was perhaps in an overblown way compared it to those Giacometti, the Giacometti stick figures that were like whittled and whittled and whittled and would break sometimes, and you start all over again and whittle and whittle and whittle. At the same time, we put a huge premium on the kind of thinking that has to be involved before you even start writing, especially if you're committing to a series of stories that are like, you know, a year-long project, or you know it's going to be 5 or 6 major pieces. We spend a lot of time talking through what the reporting shows, what the reporting might show, where we might go, what the point is, and then if you can't distill, even something like the Facebook files, if you can't distill that thing into a single sentence, even though there was many thousands of words written on that, before you put pen to paper, you're never going to write the story the right way. So thinking on the front end is, I would say, perhaps equally as important as the smoothing out on the back end.
Marcus, what can you add to that as far as developing the nut graph on a really complicated piece? And, you know, let's also bring in the idea of the headline. I think the crowd, and I as well, love that ICE flights headline. You know, we all know that you've got to SEO workshop a headline before you let it go. Developing that can take there's a lot of iteration that goes into it.
Yeah, it is, and I'm not the strongest, you know, SEO talent, so it's like a lot of back and forth with other people and just brainstorming and workshopping the headline. But I mean, to you know, go off what Matthew said, and I love being able to like take, instead of like the nut graph can be a little lengthy, and it's exactly to that point where if you can't summarize the story in one sentence, one clear, not cumbersome sentence, which could be a headline, then you need to go back and maybe, you know, change the direction of the story or the nut graph for sure. And so I always love being able to go back, like in one of the final edits, and, you know, write a headline. Not that that'll be the final headline, of course. There'll be like 5 or 10 or 15 or 25 more iterations, but just to like to summarize it in a nice clean headline is key.
And vice versa, if you can't write the headline,
Right.
or you end up with an inside there's something or other, which
Right.
you know is a bland headline, then
Right.
it clearly shows you there's something wrong with the story and it's worthwhile going back.
Right.
You know, there are never enough newsroom resources, even in the largest newsrooms. And Matthew, you've got a very inventive role in the journal newsroom. How do you help reporters and editors get the time for all important projects?
You clone them, don't you?
Well,
Just as long as enough to pay both of them.
there's a productive and an unproductive answer to that question. The productive one is, one of the things that I'm very privileged in my position to be able to do is convening power. That I can say, okay, this project is interesting. It's going to require some development work, some video expertise, some visual storytelling expertise, this reporter and this editor, and let's just get in a room and talk about them. And sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't. Sometimes other people will come to me with these ideas, and I think to Suzanne's point earlier, all of the ones on your list were reporter-generated projects, which is the best, in the best possible worlds when that's the case, every single one of them. So the convening power can be a very useful way to focus resources if you pick the right spots. Because often there's, even with constrained resources, there are people who are less employed than they should be or focus on the wrong thing. And if collectively you're making the right decisions to where to put your chips, you can bring great attention to bear. The other one is, and I hope there's not too many of my colleagues in this room, you just tell people to stop doing other stuff. Like, not everything is equally important. On any one day, you could be doing 20 things, and probably only 3 of them matter. The other 17 will not get done or take care of themselves somehow. And it's a very, it's a very hard, very easy message to give to reporters, a very hard message to give to editors. But you know, the easiest thing in the world is to not make a decision. And by not making decisions, you end up not really getting anywhere. So deciding not to do a thing, even though there are risks involved, is sort of crucial if you want to pull off the big stuff.
Yeah, it's setting priorities. I remember an editor said to me many years ago, no small potatoes.
Exactly.
In your newsroom, obviously, resources are not also considerable, and you've got to file a certain number of stories every week just to keep
Every day.
readership engaged, every day and every week.
Oh, absolutely. So at American City Business Journals, we have 43 papers across the country. We are hiring. If and I know there's some graduates or students in the audience. And every reporter writes 1 to 2 daily stories. And you know, we're feeding the beast every day. I mean, we write 15 to 20 stories every single day for the website. We still do a weekly print edition, but everything is digital first. You know, everything goes on the web first. And then we kind of cherry pick what we want to go in our Friday print edition, which we love because we can be more visual and get a little more creative with photography and things like that. So the way time management kind of works, it's different for every reporter to manage their own time, but they know they have their dailies. That they need to deliver on our prime beats. We're very focused on our beats. We can't cover everything. We're in Portland, Oregon. There's a lot happening in our city. There's a lot of big industries to cover and a lot of interesting ones, so we've really narrowed those down. But I have a weekly reporter meeting with every reporter, and they're always working on one big project, which we just call our cover story, or our cover package. So that is always on the horizon. And during those reporter meetings, we only really focus on that cover story. And where are they? What stage are they? Who have they interviewed? Who do they want to interview? Or we just brainstorm. The managing editor comes in, and we're not sure what the story is, but we know this is an issue that is important in our community. So every week we have a deliverable. That we agree on. And it's not hard and fast. I mean, I drop the ball sometimes, they drop the ball sometimes, but it's like by next week, let's try to get those 2 interviews lined up. And we know the end date when the story is going to publish. You know, we choose that a couple months out. We backdate the time that we need to have copied to the designers for the cover story. We backdate that another week where I need the draft. But by the time they give me the draft, we have mapped out that story. It is a teamwork. We've outlined it. Some reporters, we actually work out the sections of the story together. So by the time I get the draft, I know what's coming. And it's kind of up to them to work in during the week, okay, what do I owe Suzanne on this story?
Well, how often do you let them, oh man, Suzanne, this story is really developing, or I'm just confused by it, or I've got 3 sources I need to talk to tomorrow. Can I skip a day or 2 of those dailies?
Always. I always say that. I mean, I was just one of our award-winning journalists is here in the audience. He wrote 2 of those stories, and he was just saying, and he's our commercial real estate reporter, that's one of our biggest generators of page views, and we are judged, and it's annoying as an editor to have to be thinking about visits and conversions and all those things. Our content is behind a paywall. But he was saying, oh, I feel bad I didn't write a daily. I haven't written a daily really this week. And I'm like, God, you're writing the cover story that we crammed to get ready because we both wanted to come to New York and have fun and party and not worry about writing a cover story for next week. So we're it's
So you
very
make room
much
for the great
mutual.
journalism.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You know, I moderated a SABEW panel back in 2019 about the large upside that's possible with newsroom partnerships. But in addition to all the promise that they can offer, there can also be unpleasantness if it's not a smart, well-discussed match. Marcus, how does Capital and Maine handle their partnerships? I know that at least one of the pieces that was an award winner was in partnership, or actually I think both of them, one with Fast Company, the other with USA Today.
Yeah, I mean, almost all of our stories are that way, because we're a very small nonprofit. Most people probably haven't heard of us. I hope you have, but or after today, you definitely will. But I mean, that's sort of our model, is to do partnerships. And so almost every story we look for partnerships with. It could be with the Patch that's in that local part of California, because they're California based, or it could be with USA Today, which we've done a few partnerships with now. And it's a win-win because they get content, of course, and we get traffic because we have quite a small site.
So Patch has the local access, and they probably have high traffic in their community, and obviously
yeah.
USA Today has a national platform.
And some of the Gannett papers too, like especially in California, a lot of the Gannett papers will pick us up and they might have 20, 30, 40,000 readers, but that's like a very focused local story for that community. But obviously we've co-published on The Guardian, the USA Today, as I said. Yeah, Fast Company does this a lot. We've done stories in the LA Times, the Sacramento News and Review. So it's been a plethora of partners. And in general, there hasn't been too much friction. I mean, the only friction I think is with investigative stories where they're really in-depth and you're working with a partner and there's a lot of back and forth. So I had this recently with a series of stories that I wrote about the overtime wage rule in Washington, and we partnered with Fast Company, and we also got funding from different sources, and we had like 8 different editors in every Google Doc, and it got a little confusing. Less tense and just more kind of confusion and being able to figure out what's what and get our ducks in a row. But in terms of there hasn't been too much like push and pull with partners on stories. It's like they're very happy to get the content. And in some cases where it's more in depth, they contribute a lot of guidance and will give us like their resources too. Like USA Today has been able to provide like some of their infographics team to help us out, which is great for a small team. We have literally like 3 staff reporters and depend on freelancers. So we look for a lot of freelancers, picture stories to us.
And Suzanne and Matthew, you obviously both work at news organizations that have sister publications. Matthew, does the Journal ever work on stories with MarketWatch or Barron's?
Barron's, no. MarketWatch will sometimes pick up our stories. The Journal is very, 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 very anal when it comes to reporting standards and what we consider to be appropriate sourcing or how we would do a story. And our answer to partnerships is we kind of don't do them, partly for that reason. I mean, historically, they've been before we really built up our video department, we did some frontline partnerships because they had the distribution channels and the expertise on long-form video, which was super important and super successful. But generally speaking, we kind of don't do it. I would just pick up one thing Marcus said, which is a slight tangent, but I think important in this regard. Google Docs, possibly the worst invention for American journalism.
Oh, let's get into that quickly.
Yes.
I mean, it gives me hives just thinking about it. I have the luxury of not having to. I sit at the end of the process once it goes into the CMS where things are more stable. But sometimes when I dip in, I see these funny little like sea of like leprechaun puke, or these sea of cursors of different colors all over the screen, changing stuff at the same time. And it means that nothing's done, and nothing's finished, and nothing's stable. And that's how mistakes get made, and it's how at the last minute you can't publish because someone has to read the story for the 75th time because people are constantly fussing with stuff.
So are you saying the state of play that you don't use Google Docs, you prefer not to?
Me personally, I would stay as far away from it as I possibly can, but the reporters do use it quite frequently.
So for 2 years during COVID, when you weren't in the newsroom, did you just use the internal CMS?
I did, but that was not a common practice. Most people were in Google Docs, running around with like colored cursors everywhere.
I think we probably all either.
Sorry, it bothers me. And it truly is like what we do matters a lot. What you say and its precision is incredibly important. And if you have 3 reporters and 2 editors bickering over like rewriting over the top of each other on a single sentence,
at the same moment.
Yeah, you're gonna end up it's gonna be wrong or it's gonna be mush. Because it's the result of like gigantic compromise between warring parties. Someone needs to have their hand on the steering wheel.
So let's get into that. What are the rules of the road? Only one person at a time, or you control it as the editor?
By the time it gets to me, it's one person at a time. What people want to do before it gets to me is totally up to them. But if I were king, it would be like one person at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think we do that to a large extent. It's just sort of like whoever the editor is they're running the show, and then they're usually assigning the reporter or telling them to do something or add something or revise something, and then they go back in and the editor is running that page. So.
Do you use Google Docs at?
We do, but
the
not on
CMS?
projects like that. Not really for editing. I don't like them either. I just. For the long form stories that we're working on over months, where there might be 10 versions, one of those, we were just adding up how many versions of the story I edited, and then I'd send it back version 3, he'd send it back to me, version 4. And we just do, because you can track changes in Word, it's just we're just comfortable using that and it's easy. And then when it gets to a certain point, it goes into CMS.
And we were joking backstage. What is a long-form story for
Long form
Shop?
for us is I tell the reporters, I try to tell them, I think 2,000 is a nice sweet spot because I think you lose readers after a certain point. I have to think a lot of readers are reading our work during their workday, not necessarily on the weekend when they can kind of lean back. And so it doesn't always happen. I mean, we publish stories that are 3,000, but I like for a long form story about 2,000, I think is a nice.
Do they ever deadpan you and say 2,000 inches, right?
It's, there are people who 2,000 words means nothing to. And then that's where, as Matthew and I were talking about, it's like, oh, that's coming out. That's a sidebar now because this main story is going to be 2,000 words.
But then they learn, like once it happens to you once, where a story gets chopped from 4,000 words to 2,000 words, the reporter generally doesn't do that again.
Yeah.
Because that's a huge waste of time.
Yeah,
What's the
it is,
expectation at the Journal?
In the old days, we were quite rigid. The daily enterprise, for what it's worth, was like around 2,000, 2,500 words. And now, as is right, the length of the story is the length of whatever the story needs. And if it only needs 1,500 words, that's what it should get. And if it needs 10,000 words, we won't do that every day, but 2 or 3 times a year when something really deserves that kind of heft and display and that the punch that you can get from such a deeply reported and deeply written piece, then we'll do that too.
In a few minutes, I want to get to the questions from the audience, so start thinking about that, please. At some point, it becomes necessary to share story results with sources, which can be perilous on all kinds of fronts. How do you negotiate that, Suzanne?
We try not to do that. We just had back-to-back instances where we had some results for a story we did share. We shared them a little earlier than we should have, and the results changed, and we had to go. It became this kind of like, we didn't want to share it in the first place, but you want a thoughtful and informed response from the source. But we also didn't want to share data that we couldn't guarantee our results that we couldn't guarantee they wouldn't share it with somebody else, even if they told us they wouldn't. But then right on the heels of that, we had another one where it was like, gosh, we were confronted with a similar kind of issue. And I think it's great because we use data a lot. I want to be distilling results. I want to be doing that kind of journalism. And in the second case, we kind of took the lessons from the first one and said, what are the highest level results without any detail about how we got there or kind of the steps in between, just so we could get a response from a source. So we will do it, but we're careful.
Matthew?
Sharing reporting
Well, you've got to share the results
with a source
of the
or with
story.
the subject of the story.
However you want to approach it, maybe both or one of them if it's more compelling.
Well, sharing the story, like literally the literal words of the story, never,
Right,
obviously.
understood.
Just to make sure I'm not misunderstanding your question. If it's a
Well, I mean, the subject might leak the story in order to try to undermine it or
And I was talking
front-run
about
it.
data, just to be clear, like if we've distilled, we've come to this conclusion based on crunching a lot of data. So,
yeah. Sourcing maybe just leave that aside, it's a little more complicated because it depends on what source for what purpose. But for the subject of a story, the boring answer is it kind of depends, but the general principle that we operate under all circumstances is the no surprises rule. I mean, there should be nothing by the point of publication that the person who the story is about doesn't know or hasn't had an adequate, like a truly, not just like 4 hours, but an adequate chance to respond. And I often hear from the staff things that you're saying, which is, well, we can't go 2 weeks early to so-and-so because they're going to leak the story and front run us. I have a lot of strong feelings today. Front running is a thing that doesn't really exist as far as I can tell. It's a thing that reporters worry about endlessly. But if you really have the goods on something and you're going to do that story will make a splash and make waves whenever it's published, no matter what anyone does before. And if it's a bad story for the subject, they're not going to try and leak it beforehand. To make it better, they might try and put out some better news, but that's not going to ever derail your efforts. So as a general rule, earlier is always better. More engagement, more early is going to be better for the story. It's more honest, it's more ethically sound, and often produces better journalism.
But I mean, the scoop will never, ever, will be as good as obviously getting something wrong and then on the back end, after publication, realizing that. And
Or getting
that's why-
sued.
I mean, we had an experience recently where we have a very strong fact-checking team, which I think we talked about the other day, Scott, and how, I mean, it struck me for a nonprofit newsroom how we have an incredibly diligent team of fact-checkers, and almost every single story goes through a fact-checking process, and they go through every single line, and I hadn't experienced that because journalism has changed so much in the last 20 years of having that type of fact-checking where, in most cases, reporters do their own fact-checking. And I can't stress enough the importance if you're like a small newsroom or a bigger newsroom of having
Or a
team.
freelancer.
Yeah, or a freelancer of hiring somebody who can fact check your story, somebody outside who that's what they do. And so we had a situation where we were quoting a government official and sent them some of the parts of the story that applied to them and some of the statements they made and some direct sections of the story that related to them. And they were very upset at how we had paraphrased some of their comments. And so I got on the phone. They were very appreciative that we talked to them. This is all pre-publication, of course. And so we ended up, figuring out what exactly he wanted to say. And he was also some confusion about being on background versus on the record. And it was great to have all of that taken care of pre-publication. And so then he was happy that we reached out. He was very appreciative. And we worked it out, did the story. He was happy, we were happy, nothing, no boats were being rocked.
Yeah,
So
I think that's a really important point because we've noticed in, I'd say, the past 4 or 5 years after the Peter Thiel, Hulk Hogan, Gawker lawsuit and the Pink Slime lawsuit, there's a very successful, very well-paid, probably branch of the legal bar who have become experts in how to tie newsrooms in knots on libel law, and for a small newsroom like yours, it would be a death knell if anyone sues you on that front.
Yeah.
Would be very expensive and very problematic for us too. And so on the most intensive stories and the most sensitive ones, the legal and standards review, which was always a thing, but has become a lot more intense and a lot more important before we press the button.
Good stuff. Let me ask the audience if they'd like to ask questions at this time. I've got a few more, so I can keep going if...
We can just keep talking about Google Docs.
I see someone over here.
Hi, I'm Greg Miles. I'm with Investopedia. I have 2 questions. I was wondering if the net graph maybe has become even more important today than, let's say, a decade ago, because it seems to me that not as many readers are reading 2,000-word stories, although I love them and I used to write them all the time. But maybe perhaps a net graph should be 1, 2, and 3 paragraphs instead of 1. And the second question is, have there been any surveys done on what percentage of readers, let's say, read a 2,000-word story today, given their schedule versus 10 years ago? I don't know if that's been done, but it's just a question. Thank you.
I have a thought on that. I think I challenge the assumption a little bit. Certainly our experience is it's the mushy middle that's disappearing.
Right.
The pieces that are really successful are the either end of the hourglass. It's like it's news that's breaking or news you've broken that is urgent and important, or it's something that's really in depth and sophisticated and also important on its own terms that demands to be read because you've told people something new about the world in a very sophisticated way. It's the middle ground of story, which is neither news and it's not really in depth and it's kind of just 2 days' work, and those are the ones that tend to disappear.
Yeah, I agree. And those used to be, they were everywhere.
Right. The internet killed the 800-word story.
Yeah.
You still do it.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So.
Suzanne, anything to add to that?
I would just say if you're going to put content behind the paywall, then it can't be the mushy middle. You have to be giving your readers something that helps them do their job, that surprises them. We do a lot of kind of beat maintenance stories where it's just deep analysis, and it might not get a ton of visits, but it'll get conversions because it's business intelligence. It's such a kind of cliche word, but it's true. So, and as far as the nut graph, in the shorter, a 400-word web story, I wouldn't see necessarily having like a, really, that's just a story from start to finish, and that is that kind of quick turn. You're going to write that in a day, maybe do 1, 2 interviews, and we get it up on our website. But the longer stories, I'm just a big believer in the nut graph again, because you can tee up your reader for what, you can entice them and tee your reader up for your conclusions and kind of, what you distilled from that.
And anchor them in a way.
Yeah, I
They're
think
kind
so,
of like
yeah.
setting the ground for what the adventure they're
Yeah,
about to take on.
yeah, and where's the tension? You know, you get the tension in there, you get a little hint of the
Right.
results, and it's just enough to kind of pull them along, and then they will stick with you through that longer read.
So, as really experienced editors shepherding complex stories, working with, often with high confidence reporters who know their beats and are super competitive and are, you know, often jostling for their rightful place in the newsroom, how do you guide them on when to stop reporting? We're talking about story length. So through that prism, you know, there's the idea of the 400-word story, the 800-word story, the 2,000 or 3,000-word story, the maybe once a year 5,000 or 10,000-word story. How do you decide when to tell reporters we need to stop
You
reporting?
need to have a despotic editor above you. I mean, I always over-report. I always constantly over-report, and I'm the one responsible, you know, true confession, for like pushing the reporters to like do more reporting. So every single story that comes in, I'm like, nah, how about this? And let's ask about this. And then it ends up taking an extra few days. So I'm guilty as charged. So I probably need another editor above me to crack the whip, because that is, you can over-report forever. It sounds like a, you know, Borges short story.
And
just
then
keep
you can
reporting.
overwrite, you know,
Yeah,
and
and then
you're
you can
like,
overwrite, and then it ends up being a gobbledygook. And
yeah, you want more, you want to put everything in there. I mean, that we all do this. You got to make those hard decisions, you know, where keep your story narrowly focused and start letting other things fall away. But the deadline is the key, and it's like at some point, and I have reporters who will report right up to the last minute, and I just have to kind of cut it off sometimes, or I just found this, or I just found that, and unless it's really going to change the direction of the story, you just say, we're done, you
That's
know,
next
I need
week's
it.
story.
Yeah, it's like,
Or
I need
tomorrow's
it.
story.
Right, right, yeah, you could say that's something you can follow up. I mean, that's the beauty of printing on doing daily stories every day. We're constantly feeding, and you know, we're always drawing back on our cover stories, or we're leading up to them with web stories. So if it's a complicated topic that our readers don't know about, I'll tell the reporter, let's write 2 or 3 dailies on this over the next month, you know, and we'll pull little pieces out of that story that will tee the readers up, so by the time they get to that cover of their story, like, oh, NFTs, yeah, you know, okay, here's how that might relate to an Oregon business, because we've teed them up a little bit.
How does that impact your work?
I guess I would say that for a really sort of, if you're putting it in the category of really big investigative projects, for example, you can't really over or under report. If you're under-reported, you don't really, you haven't got the story.
Yeah.
And so you have to report as much as you need to, and then when you've got it, and that should be pretty clear. There have been some examples recently which the outcome was right, but it was frustrating to me that I would present the story to my boss, and I would say, hey, we have it. And he said, well, no, you haven't. This is weak, and don't trust this guy, and what about this? And we would go back and do it again and get more support for what we had to say. And I would go back and say, hey, we have this thing, we've improved it. He said, yeah, but like, what about this? And if I prod here, it's still a bit squishy, we did it again. And iteratively until the point at which we felt, okay, we've done the best we can, we've said what we can say, and we're going to publish the story. So you do as much, in some ways, it's a tautology, but you do as much as you need to do. Can I go back to the nut graph question for 1 second? The thing that has changed, I think, quite dramatically, even though not everyone abides by this rule, it's not so much that the nut graph, I don't think, is the thing that will keep a reader's attention. It's the thing that will, to my mind, more often than not destroy readers' attention is the meandering, pointless, anecdotal lead that goes on for 4 or 5 paragraphs involving a person you meet once and never again for the rest of the story, with a gear crunching around paragraph 5. We say, this thing we just made you read for 5 paragraphs, in fact, reflects this big thing that's happening across America, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That stuff is just like, put a line through it. I mean, if you want to kill someone's interest or make them stop reading, that's the best way to do it.
That's a great anecdote. Let me go back to the audience. Over here, please.
Hi, I'm Oliver Staley, business editor of The Observer. And first of all, thank you for your nut graph evangelism. I am always pushing reporters to include nut graphs, and I write them myself if they don't do it. I was wondering, I think most of you have a print component to your publications, but even if you don't, or if you do, but you're also online a lot as well. Now, I'm wondering how you think about packaging multiple stories when most of your stories are going to be read online, and therefore there exists in this SEO world where each story might be found individually. I'm wondering how you think about like sidebars, whether you try and stuff more into the main bar so you don't have multiple stories. I'm just wondering, like, strategically, when you're putting together a lot of work does it make sense to try and put in as few stories as possible because you risk those smaller stories never being found?
I mean, we're only online, and I think I like the fact that instead of having these huge, what I call thumbsuckers, like massive story with like 3 sidebars, and it's just like one of those things in the Sunday paper you get, we can't do those, obviously. So we split it up like this overtime series we launched this week. We had a story every day of the week. Well, it's a 4-part series, so we kicked it off Tuesday. We have a different story every day. And then the other components, there's a quiz attached, then an infographic, several infographics, and a slideshow. Those are all separate components that we're constantly pushing out. And I think each story was about 2,000, 2,500 words. So it was a nice way to sort of tell this, like the narrative of the week, to break it out over days and to have different components, and some days featured, every day had like a little special dessert. Like
Just to follow, I guess, how confident are you that all the readers are going to see all the components when you do it that way?
They won't. That they won't. And so you try, I think, with social media and other, that's one of the main ways we get traffic, is just to kind of tease out that it's part of a package. And so every day you're saying, part 2 coming up. And you give little, almost Hollywood-like cliffhangers. Not that was in the story, but more in social media to kind of promote it. But you don't know that. You just hope that, I think, because you have all the links in the story, that someone reading that story and they're touched by it, they'll obviously want to read the other components. They'll realize that this is part of a multi-part series, and they'll want to, come read the other stories. If not, that might happen. That's a risk you take. So
I think there's a bunch of online furniture you can use that will help. I agree with Marcus. We would never do multiple, 3 parts of a series on the same day, because then parts 2 and 3 will just be completely ignored. There's no way you can get around that. I also the idea of a sidebar on the internet doesn't make any sense to me. Like, what's it to the side of, behind your phone somewhere? Right. But if you're thinking about a series, it's a designated thing with a title and or something a body of work over the course of so months that links together in an important way. You can do a landing page, and there's related links at the side, a little sidebar box on the page that can say, this is part of a continuing coverage. Here's the 4 other stories that will very clearly indicate to a reader there's more to go find if they want to go find it. I know landing pages are controversial. Often they're poorly trafficked, but they can be a really excellent way to gather together coverage. And when you have a massive hit, they can actually perform a hugely important function to stop people getting lost sometimes in big series, which is very easy to do on a website or on an app, where you click the wrong place and you can never find the starting place again.
How'd you think about that with the Facebook files?
We did one.
Starting out, did you already have that?
Yep, we planned a landing page from the beginning of that. And we did it not knowing whether anyone would ever go there. It was partly for internal organization, and partly on the hope that it would be a big deal and therefore people would find it. It ended up being a substantial traffic driver, because people would Google Facebook files and they'd find the landing page first and then find all the stories. So it doesn't always work, but it can be a really effective way of overcoming the problem you're talking about.
Sometimes if it's just a package, well, I was just going to say, we do just cover stories, and they most always have multiple elements to them. So you might have the 1,500-word main story, and then you're going to have a 400-word sidebar, and maybe some big numbers. So we publish everything at once then, and then, until we blast it out, or we put it on social media, or it goes out in one of our digital newsletters, no one's going to see that. So we have the luxury of if some people will just go to our website, they might happen to see it at the top of the news river. But most times we can be strategic. And so every week we kind of are focused on that. Okay, we'll get an infogram made for the numbers, and then you can just embed that in the middle of the main story. And the sidebar might end up being just a link, to a link back. But that way you just kind of get it all published, and then you can just do your cross links and maybe an infogram.
Talking about content and landing pages and how they can work and when they might not, I was thinking back to years ago in journalism school when a professor was lamenting that, when television had the ability to go live for the first time so easily, let's go live to the weatherman out on the street who's going to tell us that, yes, it's June and it's sunny. There was this period, I don't know, a decade ago when word news organizations like all the 3 of yours felt obliged to use all the different facets of rich media. So you wouldn't have a big project without the video and the embedded social media tweets and audio or some combination of those. Is that still important, do you think, or do you try to just judge on a case-by-case basis whether video and audio and all the other, certainly informational graphics I think are vital, but how do you decide how to accessorize a story?
Well, you don't do it just for the sake of doing it, obviously. So that's like from the get-go. You're like, okay, what's going to enhance this story? Like, will it be, it's a story that involves, people, and we want to hear their voices, and it'd be really dramatic to have a video in which we, go to their destroyed homes by the tornado and talk to them. That's ideal. But maybe an infographic doesn't really make sense for that story. So really, I think it's on a case-by-case basis in most cases.
What about with your content?
I don't think video works great for business journalism always, When I worked at another company, it was in the early stages of doing video, and we did this little show set up where we was kind of inside the deal, and we would, bring somebody in, and we'd interview them, and it never took off. And so I feel like the business audience is a little different than your kind of broader consumer audience, so that's one factor. And honestly, in our newsrooms, we don't really have the resources to do it well. I think if we could do video better, we might just do video pieces that we would put up, like a 2 minutes with the CEO, like you're interviewing them anyway for a print story, but maybe you get 2 clips and we edit it quickly and we throw it up online. That could work, but right now we're not doing that, and in part it's just resources, I think.
Is it integral to journal coverage, do you think, Matthew?
Yeah. Oh, video in particular? Or video is tricky. We have a big video department, and increasingly, it increasingly does its own work and does its own projects, and that's both quick hit news stuff, but also long form, sort of try to sell to Netflix kind of projects. What we try to do increasingly, although often we default to words, is find the best medium for whatever the project is we want to do. So if it's, and increasingly to my mind, the most exciting ones are audio and video investigations. I mean, not video meaning something that looks like it came off a TV broadcast, but video, take Ukraine, for example, using the extraordinary amount of crowdsourced video material that's streaming out of that war to perform an investigation as to what happened in this street or what happened in this town, which you can do now, which you couldn't have done before, which is an extraordinary opportunity and a really exciting new visual medium. And audio the same way. We had a conversation yesterday with a reporter and a woman who runs our podcast team, a 3-part podcast series on his story, and he says, I still want to write a story. It's like, well, why would you want to do that? You have an extraordinarily exciting new medium. You put together this incredible piece. It's okay to skip the story. It's just fine. So I think letting the right medium attach itself to the right topic and letting the two work together as best they possibly could, not forcing one into another, and not forcing every possible medium into one topic in order to kind of make it look cool, is what we're increasingly trying to do.
So I guess when it works organically.
Yeah.
Let me see if the audience has, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Any other questions from the audience? I think I see one, can't see through the lights. Oh, please, go ahead.
So when it comes to engaging with y'all's audience when you do sort of these deep dives or bigger works, have you noticed that you've changed the presentation or, stood up any sort of like events to help people engage with the story more, or if it's something that maybe could change laws or change, the sort of status quo, that you sort of fold that into the rollout?
I think if we're doing a big enough story where we think it could, I'm just trying to think of an example where we've really been strategic well in advance, thinking that, we need we need to time this to right before the legislature, and we don't do a lot of that, to be honest with you. When you started your question, I was just thinking of the different ways we present things in print and online, and there is a huge difference there, and that's the headline. The web head is very different. It's the whatever your awesome headline was there about ice pickers or whatever it was.
yeah.
Yes, that, you know, that maybe is not going to be the print headline, but it works beautifully for the digital. And then honestly, our numbers show that social is becoming so important, not Twitter necessarily. Like for us, LinkedIn is huge, you know. I mean, our readers are on LinkedIn. It's a, you know, very, you know, we're looking at a hyper-local market of business people. So sharing stories, I'll say that's a LinkedIn. I'm going to be sure that I share it, make sure our Business Journal account shares it, and that we're tagging all the right people. So social's becoming a big driver of traffic for us.
Do you promote it yourself?
I do. I mean, the only social media I know I should use more is, the only one I use is LinkedIn, just because everything else depresses me. And, you know, I know a lot of the reporters use Twitter, and I encourage it. But for me, LinkedIn, so I have my personal LinkedIn, but it's all work. And you know, it's amazing. I started really this year, last year, making it a real focus, and it has just taken off. And we can see a lot of engagement from my own post, and then we have, of course, the Business Journal post as well.
Any last comments?
I mean, in general, I mean, to that point, I mean, I think partly in terms of impact, which is kind of what I think partly what the question is, as I said before, we have a small newsroom, and so we depend a lot on these partnerships. And if we don't have partnerships, there's a lot of newsletters out there that are specifically geared towards, you know, obviously the Politico newsletters, and newsletters that are read by, you know, members of Congress and influential people. And we'll have relationships with those newsletter writers. And so if there's an interesting story that fits that newsletter in the LA Times or in Politico, we'll, you know, reach out to our friend over there, and they'll, you know, include that. And then it'll get picked up, and it has sort of a life of its own. But, you know, timing is obviously a big part of it. And so exactly when you do the stories, knowing that there's going to be some vote or there's some debate happening in Congress over something, and just having that news instinct to know that this is an important story. It's going to matter to these people who make decisions.
And just a real life experience. We are measured on visits and conversions and these things, and we see the numbers every week on what's trafficking. So that's just the reality.
Conversions meaning subscriptions.
Conversions meaning, did your story get someone to buy a subscription? Yes. So that's what we call them. But so on the flip side of the important stories and having the right partners in important places so that they're picking up your story, that's super important. Also, if we have a really consumer-friendly story, we have a TV news partner, and we might unlock that story and send it to our news partner so that they'll put it on the top of their website, they'll put it out on their Facebook page, and we know that that story is going to get many thousands of visits. So we're very strategic on, you know, is this a consumer-friendly story? We have a TV news partner that we trade stories with. So we do think about that for sure.
Matthew, any last words on that thought? Or
Just to add, that all seems right to me, especially newsletters as a way to get information out there. This is deep in the bowels of like promotional thinking, but one thing which is easier to say and hard to do is every topic you do has a group of people who are connected to each other somewhere, a Facebook group or in LinkedIn, who are passionate about that thing, or Reddit, more likely, and finding ways to put the stuff you've done in front of them without making it seem promotional and without saying, hey, please share our stuff, is hard to do. But also when you can do it, when you can put your story about,
And hard with Reddit in particular.
whatever it is, right? You're about GameStop in front of all the GameStop lunatics, then you know you're off to the races.
Yeah.
well, I really want to thank our panelists today and our Best in Business Award winners, all three of them: Matthew Rose, Enterprise Editor at the Wall Street Journal; Marcus Baran, Special Projects Editor at Capital Maine. He's got some other projects going as well. And Suzanne Stevens, Editor of the Portland Business Journal. Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
More on the Best in Business Awards coming up in a few minutes.